And welcome back to our discussion on what the pandemic has taught us about how to do things more efficiently within the government acquisition system. And for this part of the program, we're going to get an industry perspective on some of those lessons learned that we were just discussing with Major General Holt. For that, we're going to turn to Michael Weaver, Product Innovation Director at ProPricer, George Barbick, the Director of Estimating, Program Assessment, and Evaluation at Lockheed Martin, and Hagen McHenry, Vice President for Pricing, Strategy, and Intelligence at Periton. Thank you all for joining us. And as part of this programming, we talked with Major General Cameron Holt, who is the Deputy Assistant Director, Deputy Assistant Secretary, I should say, for contracting at the Department of the Air Force. And he made, I thought, a lot of interesting points on how they have navigated through COVID. And the one thing that I think he kept coming back to was that they have operated this almost like a contingency contracting environment in the sort of way that they would do in a wartime situation. And with all those authorities turned on, they had the kind of flexibility that allowed them to almost look at the acquisition system from the outside while running the acquisition system and figure out new, more efficient ways of doing things where they weren't necessarily as constrained by the traditional rules and just move a lot faster more generally. For our industry panelists, I guess I'd like to start by asking, how apparent has that been to you during the course of the pandemic and working with the government? How different have things been? George, let me start with you on that question.
Okay, let me just address that from my perspective, and it obviously has been extremely it's been an extreme change really for us as far as not being able to really have face-to-face meetings, not being able to do things that you're used to doing, but the adaptation's really been amazing by the majority of our workforce, being able to find alternate ways of getting things done and making things happen. It's been an amazing kind of transition of trying to be as seamless as possible. And I'm not going to say there's zero effects, because there's obviously lots of effects. I mean, you have to make sure that your workforce is safe, taken care of, looking at things, making sure your supply chain stays viable. But it's been a great transition, being able to use, people, 2/3 of our workforce working from home, being able to make the adjustments that they need to do to be able to try to keep things on schedule as best as you possibly can. And obviously there are effects. We've seen effects throughout our industry, but being able to use Zoom and Slack and Skype and all these different things to be able to get your jobs done and work around, and the adaptation of our workforce to that has been it's been really, through this pandemic, it's been very encouraging. And
just to follow up quickly, I think what we've heard over and over again from your government customers is, at least at the very beginning, there was a pretty steep learning curve in just adopting the technologies, like you mentioned, Zoom, and getting the authorizations to do that. In those first few weeks in March, how rocky was that transition for you? Were you pretty well set up from a technology perspective to make that transition?
I think that there was a lot of the uncertainty involved with what's happening next, where we had it. But to me, the transition, while difficult, was, everybody made those adjustments, those little steps along the way, just to keep everything moving, keep the communication going, figuring out how to do it. I'll use the example, we were working something with our government customers, like, well, how are we going to do this? But the innovation on both the government side and our side, and the communication and the transparency has been really, really encouraging. As far as being able to work together to a solution. How do we get that? Well, we usually do that face to face, but being able to say, okay, we're going to put it here, we're going to do that, or make ourselves available. That's been, like I said, I think it's gone off very well. It's not without some effects in some areas. It has definitely driven some things that maybe wouldn't have happened before, but it's also shown another side. And, having people not entering facilities, for the foreseeable future while we get through this, it makes you realize you have to plan and you have to adapt. And just from a personal standpoint, who knows where we're going to be in the future as far as with people working from home. So we may have seen kind of a shift here through this pandemic. Obviously, you can't do that in some of the classified arenas and in some of the things in your factories, but other than that, I think things have gone as smoothly as can be expected, and there's been so much communication and transparency on both sides. So that's been very encouraging. And I'll stop at that, Jared.
Sure. Hey, Hagen, let me turn to you on some of those same questions. How has this period looked for your folks at Periton?
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Jared. I think there was a real concern going into March that the acquisition community and the government was going to have a real pause. We survive on new business, new growth, and we were worried that it was really going to slow down, and quite the opposite happened. We did have obviously some delays and push to the right on some of the large opportunities, but we actually, at least my team, we had an increase in pricing actions that we were submitting to the government. We saw a lot of contract extensions, ECPs. So the acquisition community did a really phenomenal job of continuing to get acquisitions and procurements out the door and back in and awarded. And so kudos to the government for keeping things running.
Michael, any observations on these topics? I mean, back to sort of the first question I opened with, has it been apparent from the outside that the government has gotten more agile during this, as General Holt put it, contingency contracting period?
Absolutely. I think that part of it comes from the Cloud Smart policy and their ability to adapt to remote work very, very quickly. So they were able to implement software and get access to it from virtually anywhere. That made it on the federal government side very turnkey for them to be able to go and start working remotely much faster than I guess we all expected. And so for us, that's presented us problems, as a software vendor, on how to make the software more readily available for government agencies and for federal contractors to sort of meet that need. Because as you're outside of your network and you're trying to get into the applications that you're using, just the ability to have access to stuff has really helped us put more of a focus on SaaS versions of our applications. So, thinking about how we can make those things readily available, highly deliverable, and to sort of shorten the time that it takes for people to come up to speed on the product have been major focuses for us. And it's been nice to see both government and industry focusing on those things, so that things like COVID, when they happen, it really doesn't hurt as much as you would expect it to.
One of the things toward the beginning of the interview with Major General Holt that I thought was really important is that they kind of hit the ground running when COVID struck, because they had done a lot of work in advance preparing for great power competition with China in ways that they think made their system more agile and ready to adapt to a COVID type situation, including by getting rid of what he deemed to be a lot of outdated and unnecessary procedures. And I'd like to ask a variant of that same question of our industry panelists here. Before COVID, what sorts of things had you done to reduce the time it takes to spin up a new bid and proposal, to shorten the length of time that whole process takes for you? Of course, in many ways, you're dependent on how quickly the government can move, but within your own space, what had you done to shorten those timelines? George, you want to start with that?
So let me address that, and maybe this won't be as popular as you want to hear, but the one thing, the concern we always have is that you have to meet all your government regulations, the FAR, the DFARs, and that hasn't gone away. And I will say that the government has done a lot of innovative things. The DPAP office that they have, they've run some pilots that Kim Periton has pushed, and they've done some really things to do some fast turn. But for the most part, we still have the same rules and regulations that we have to do. So all the things that we need to do and put into our proposals, and make sure that we're compliant are still in effect. And there are some pilots out there that are waiving some of those things, and they're great pilots and they're great things to do. But I think on both parts, we still have to do all the things that we need to do. The government has to do all the things that they need to do. And sometimes in negotiations, in order to make sure that the government, the taxpayers, and the warfighters get the best deal, those things are still in place. And over the years, we've seen the timelines reduce with some of the things that have been put in place, with the government, and that's a good thing. But I do want to put that caution there, because I think, all the safeguards that have been in place for both the contractor and the government are still in place and are still working. Now, that's not to say that, there's not more innovation, there's not more go fast type activities that have been the focus of the government and are working. But for the most part, we're still working with the same sets of rules that have been in place for several years. So I'll kind of stop there, and especially, I won't stop, because especially with some of the large procurements and with all the with all the oversight and the things that need to be done on there, it probably goes without saying that, that's there and that's needed.
I don't think COVID necessarily played too much of a role in the change of process. Periton's a unique case. Periton only came into existence in 2017, a spin-off Veritas venture. And since that time, we've been investing a lot in our own internal capture processes, streamlining of those processes, making sure that they're the right processes, the approvals, all the things we need to do. But I think as George had mentioned, to get a proposal out the door, we have to follow all the T's and C's. And so I wouldn't say that those have necessarily changed too much. One of the things that for Periton has been really great, and call it foresight or just the leadership of Rob Ginetta, our CIO, was that in 2017 we switched to a cloud environment. A really resilient cloud environment that allows us to pretty much access all of our stuff from any device, any place, anytime. And so when COVID hit and we went remote, we were prepared. We also boosted some of our network, and it really allowed us to make a seamless transition. There's benefit of working in a war room and captures and working with collaboratively with peers, person to person. And we missed that, but at the same time, we really limited the impact of how COVID's changed our processes, because we've already built that infrastructure to move that remote. So our processes aren't necessarily different; they're just now virtualized, and we've been able to make that work without any sort of delay.
All right, need to take a short break here. I'm your moderator, Jared Serbu. You're listening to the discussion, Lessons from a Pandemic, How to Overcome Acquisition Bureaucracy, sponsored by ProPricer on Federal News Network.